All right, Darwinian faith versus the faith of our fathers. You know, one thing about Americans is we pride ourselves on being optimistic. Generally, we pride ourselves on being optimistic about our national future and about our personal lives. But one thing is, in recent years, it seems like we have a lot of serious problems that are multiplying and they're not going away. It doesn't seem like we're dealing with them. For example, when we look at our schools seem to be failing. The latest PISA study, and PISA is, I think, the most authoritative international assessment group, ranks American students now at 38th among the industrialized or developed countries. When we look at our economy as another example that's really struggling, the latest Bureau of Labor Statistics report, this is just in August, shows that the labor participation rate in America is now the lowest it's been since 1973. So even though the unemployment rate is coming way down, it's come down not because there's more jobs and more people working, it's because more people have structurally just given up working altogether. Another aspect of this, just in the last 6 years, we've seen federal spending increase 35% at a time when we're going broke. And the national debt has increased, it's about doubled just in the last 6 years. So it's taken us 236 years to get to about $9 trillion in debt. In the last 6 years, we've about doubled that. And another aspect of this is there's no real serious attempt right now or effort or progress getting any of these things under control. When we look at dependency and poverty, 110 million American families now are receiving some form of means-tested welfare. That's SNAP, that's WIC, that's housing, that's Medicaid. The poverty rate now is 15%. That's higher than it was when Lyndon Baines Johnson began the war on poverty by starting to expand the welfare programs in 1965. The United States now has the highest corporate tax rate in the world. It is generally recognized, although this isn't really empirical, it's generally recognized as we have more regulations now than any other developed nation in the world. We have more lawsuits per capita than any other nation in the world. And businesses and capital are leaving America at an alarming rate. This man, Wayne Jianlin, is an international businessman and a leader. He happens to be the richest man in China. He spoke at the World Economic Conference this year in Davos, Switzerland. And he was talking about why it's a lot easier to do business now in Europe than anywhere else, or the United States in particular. And he said, and I heard him say this, cut the speech, why would you want to do business in the US when the government is gunning for you? When we turn our attention to the culture is fragmented. We have conflict between black versus white, female versus male, LGBT versus straight, rich versus poor, religious versus secular. Our society now is highly eroticized. I don't think that's very controversial. And we have a tremendous amount of moral chaos, traditional, progressive, and everything in between. If we take a look around at the families around us and the people in our lives, we notice there's a lot of family dysfunction, substance abuse, depression, violence, and crime. So what can we do about all this? We can stay optimistic and keep hoping. I kept searching for the right word to put in there, whether it's hoping, pretending, supposing, what are we doing here? We can keep hoping that our society is evolving to a higher state, or we can face the troubling possibility that something is going really wrong. We're off track, and we need to make a change. In fact, in recent decades, many Americans, and I could probably put most there based on the superficiality of people's initial responses, but many Americans have exchanged traditional beliefs about God, human identity, and morality in favor of Darwinian philosophy. Maybe some of our problems have to do with this philosophical shift going on in our culture. The Pilgrims, Puritans, and other people who came to America from Europe were mostly devout Christians who believed life is sacred. They believed that God loves us. They believed that we should live moral lives. And they believed that we're part of a divine plan. These are the people that founded America. Darwinian philosophy, conversely, promotes a mechanistic and material view of life. Human beings are accidents of nature with no spiritual identity or eternal purpose. In his 1959 book on the origin of species by means of natural selection, Darwin said new animal forms are created from common ancestors through random variation and natural selection. He himself wasn't anti-God per se, and even in the cover of his book, he had some quotes from a reverend and another theologian that said God is working these things out through natural laws. But the 19th century atheist philosophers of the day, people like you see here, Spencer, Nietzsche, Huxley, and Marx, globbed onto his philosophy and promoted it aggressively in Western culture. That aggression continued into the 20th century. In the early part of the 20th century, in the 1920s, 1930s, Darwinism went through a restating and a rethinking with our growing knowledge of genetic information, and it's called the Neo-Darwin synthesis. The leaders of that movement were all prominent atheists and progressive philosophers, like this man pictured here, George Gaylord Simpson. He was a leader in that movement. He said, mankind is the product of purposeless processes that didn't have him in mind. This man, Jacques Monod, a little later in the 1960s, won the Nobel Prize for his work on genetic regulations. He said, the ancient covenant is in pieces. Man knows at last that he is alone in the universe's unfeeling immensity, out of which he emerged only by chance. This was a UCSD textbook. It could still be being used, but I know it was being used until just within the last few years. It's written by Douglas Fukuyama, a leading Darwinist in our day. He says, quote, by coupling undirected, purposeless variation to the blind, uncaring process of natural selection, Darwin made theological or spiritual explanations of life processes superfluous and purposeless. A recent Newsweek article that compared the impacts of Charles Darwin and Abraham Lincoln, who coincidentally share the same birthday, in discussing what Darwinism said, quote, mankind was no longer the culmination of life, but merely part of it. Creation was mechanistic and purposeless. And the king of Darwinism himself, in our times, Richard Dawkins, has said repeatedly and in various ways, but this is a precise quote from River Out of Eden, the universe that we observe has precisely the properties we should expect if there is, at the bottom, no design, no purpose, no evil, and no good, nothing but blind, pitiless indifference. So this is the stark fact that we need to deal with. Darwinian leaders from the beginning have made, and by the way, they have said that this is a non-scientific claim, that God is dead, that life is accidental and purposeless, that moral standards are only human inventions that change like the wind, that nothing is inherently right or wrong, and that there is no good or evil, virtue or vice. Let's pause here for a moment, just get a picture of these images. This guy here, Nietzsche, he's the guy who said in the 19th century, God is dead. He hated Christianity and all forms of traditional religion, and he was completely amoral. Moving into the 1960s, Jean-Paul Sartre, a very influential 20th century philosopher, steeped in Darwinian philosophy, he said there is no morality. The greatest good comes by acting out in accordance with what you feel inside authentically. In other words, if you feel like acting out, do it. Pushing the little old lady in front of the bus is morally equivalent to helping her across the street. And of course, this gentleman here, Saul Alinsky, he brought this philosophy into the world of politics, specifically progressive politics. He said that the way to practice politics and get your agenda done is through deception and ridicule. And those philosophies have been pretty prominent parts of the progressive politics in our country ever since. He wrote Rules for Radicals, and in the cover of his book, I've seen it and I read it myself, he dedicates that book to Lucifer, the father of lies. That's the way he gets his political agenda done. And he says what you need to do to get your progressive agenda done in the United States is you present a reassuring and patriotic image. Tell people you're patriotic and traditional and all that, and then you go do the opposite. And we see that happening in our country. Of course, it doesn't take a genetic engineer to see how these ideas impact our personal beliefs, values, culture, and public policy. Just to clarify, right now we're just talking about the philosophical implications of Darwinism. We're not talking about the actual empirical evidence, which in recent decades has stacked up considerably against Darwinism. And we can discuss that more in the question and answer period if you like. But if this is true, if Darwinism is true and we're only accidents of nature and there is no spiritual reality, we might as well eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow we die. And that seems to be something that is taking over the West with greater and greater ferocity. In fact, Darwinian leaders like Michael Shermer, Alfred Kinsey, Erica Jong, and other leaders assure us that traditional sexual mores are dangerous, harmful, and unhealthy. Because it is created by Darwinian evolution, sexual expression such as adultery, promiscuity, pornography, homosexuality, pedophilia, bestiality, and bigamy are normal, natural, and should be acceptable. I love this one slide. It's from the Big Bang TV program. You can't blame yourself. When your prefrontal cortex fails to make you happy, promiscuity rewards you with the needed flood of dopamine. This is the society we live in now. It's all about chemistry and particles and gratification. In a Darwinian world where life isn't sacred after all, embryos are only a mass of purposeless particles. Abortion is perfectly acceptable and infanticide is logical. In a Darwinian world, when the useful phase of life is over, euthanasia and assisted suicide are reasonable, and because it saves so much money, it's only desirable as a public policy. In a Darwinian world, marriage isn't sacred, it's only an evolutionary artifact. It has decreasing social relevance, and it's a transient legal arrangement. We talked about this man already, Jean-Paul Sartre, who brought home the point and the implication of Darwinism in the moral existential sense that the greatest good is created by just acting out in accordance with your own desires. Nothing is virtuous or noble. This man, Clarence Darrow, defended the teaching of evolution in the famous Scopes monkey trial. Before that, he defended two men who were convicted of murder against receiving the death penalty, and the basis of his argument was that the men are only acting out in accordance with the Darwinian phase of evolution in which they found themselves. They cannot be held accountable. At the end of his life, he said, "I've lived a life without purpose, without meaning, without direction. I don't know where I came from, and I don't know what I'm doing." We need to face this fact. In a Darwinian world, there is no good and evil, and that leaves us in a lost state. Moral standards are only human inventions that change like the wind. Darwinism changes everything. Science, biology, politics, education, art, marriage, family, sex, faith, life, and death. And here's where it leads us to. If we try to get our arms around all these issues and organize them in our mind, we can see that if we examine a particular issue, and in this case, you can see particular issues on the left side, on the left-hand column, and we compare what Darwinism teaches about that issue compared to what our traditional Judeo-Christian faith teaches about that issue, we see a stark contrast. Creation, for example, when we start here at the top line, according to Darwinian doctrines, creation is a random, inexplicable event with no inherent goodness or beauty. But our Judeo-Christian doctrines teach us that the heavens and earth are a divine creation with transcendent goodness and beauty. Human identity in a Darwinian world, human beings are accidents of nature. We're just chemical, mechanical systems with no spiritual identity. In a Judeo-Christian world, human beings are sons and daughters of a living God. We are spiritual beings with a divine identity. I'm not going to go through every one of these, but I want to look one more time at the issue of marriage because the differences are so stark. When we take the idea of marriage in a Darwinian world, marriage is just a survival mechanism. It has decreasing significance in a modern world, and there's nothing sacred about it. It's just a transient legal arrangement that you can do or undo. In a Judeo-Christian world, marriage is a sacred commitment between two people and God, and it signifies God's faithfulness to us. Wherever we look, we need to come to terms with this if we're serious thinkers about what's going on in our culture today. Darwinian philosophy, which is closely aligned with progressive philosophy and atheism, is starkly at odds with the teachings of our Judeo-Christian heritage. So that brings us to the question, am I crazy? I mean, of course, saying that you need God in a secular society sounds a little crazy now, doesn't it? It's like calling for tax cuts if you're at the Democratic National Convention, or like the Republicans calling for more regulation. It'd be like the NRA wanting more gun control laws. Say, in this society, we're modern, we're past religion, we're all this, but we need God. But when we think about it, these questions raise some pretty pertinent questions right now for where we live our life. For example, how has Darwinian thinking influenced you? Do you really believe that your life is random, a random accident with no ultimate purpose or meaning? Has Darwinian teachings made our society better or worse? Will it make your own life better or worse? Or would our lives in society maybe be better if we reconsidered our Judeo-Christian heritage and Christian teachings and values like love, forgiveness, grace, honesty, sexual purity, marital fidelity, and sanctity of life? And if you catch yourself thinking that we might need a little more of what is sacred in our culture, maybe the best place to start is in your own life. And maybe when you search your own heart and mind, you will find deep inside the belief that your life matters. And if you find such faith, yield to it, treasure, and keep searching. Because just a little deeper, where it has been repressed by our culture, you may also discover faith in a just and holy God who loves you and who cares for you. Psalm 139, 13 to 15 says, "For you formed my inward parts. You knitted me together in my mother's womb. I praise you, for I am fearfully and wonderfully made. Wonderful are your works. My soul knows it very well. My frame was not hidden from you when I was being made in secret, intricately woven in the depths of the earth." Thank you very much.
One of the arguments that I have with my friends who are non-Christians and secularists and Darwinian is probably bordering on the human freedom to choose whatever he wants. And the biblical mandates that at times you have to limit certain human freedom in order to achieve a higher goal. Specific on the questions of gay marriage, of course he was pro-gay marriage. The questions was raised on practical terms of where civilizations could survive. If Darwinianism philosophy gains, a major foothold in a society and leads the people to its natural conclusion that there would be total freedom to do whatever they want, and if there would be less and less family, would it cause the collapse of society and civilization, for that matter. And the other one issue was the human happiness. Are we happier to be people of faith? That means that there's a surety in us that is meaningful. there's a deeper purpose that satisfies the deepest needs of the human soul and the human desire. So that will be a question to add in.
I don't see a lawless society in a Darwinian society. I see a kind of a degenerating moral society in a Darwinian society. It's different. Like in our society now, I think we've become more and more Darwinian, right? But we have more and more laws. Because we need more and more laws. So there's more and more laws and more authority. Because we're less free, because we're less moral. I don't know if that, if